welcome to Keen on Yoga, back again. And what should be a time of celebration? It's the 200th podcast that we've done, in fact. It is a celebration. Nevertheless, it's a marker point, isn't it? Obviously, much maligned with the recent news of Sharath's passing. So I haven't really felt inclined to share any yoga content recently because it just hasn't really felt appropriate. But nevertheless, I thought I'd do a podcast episode for this 200th on my own, because what I wanted to do, instead of do a guest interview and pretend that nothing has happened and nothing is happening in terms of the process that I think we're all going through, really, is to do an episode reflecting on my own journey again, as the 200th episode might lead to, and try and lead in with how I've related that to Mysore and the figure of Sharath in Mysore. So it's a kind of try to do everything at once in a way. Another commemoration in a certain respect, but also just an honest kind of look back at how Mysore and the figure of Sharath has influenced my practice. So it's not going to be massively long, I hope. So please stay tuned till the end, and I hope you enjoy it. So why I started was mental health reasons. I've talked to you about that before. Simply, I'd suffered anxiety and depression since I was young, and I'd been medicated since I was about 12 or 13, embarrassingly, and it kind of come and gone, and I suffered through, and I got good grades at school, and it's kind of semi-popular, but nevertheless, it was always there. These kind of feelings that I couldn't really solve on my own. So I thought I'd study philosophy at university. It seemed like the thinking was helping, and a lot of the feelings centered around this feeling of meaninglessness of life, that it was just material reality and nothing else, and the hollowness of it all. And then I found this book on my father's bookshelf. It was Carlos Castaneda, Tales of Power. And if anyone knows about Carlos Castaneda, he was an anthropologist, and well, some people say that he made the whole thing up, but apparently he studied with Native American shamans, and Don Juan, who was the subject of Tales of Power, shows him how to kind of use shamanic practices to discover a deeper side of reality. And that gave me hope. And that led me on from that one book to start reading generally. And so I started reading philosophy. By the time I was 18 at university, I'd read a lot of philosophy, a lot of the major works out there, really. Not the modern stuff, but all the classics. And I thought, it was slightly helping me. It did give me slightly more meaning. But when I arrived at university, and I started suffering again, because it's a time of upheaval and crisis. I started suffering more. And I went to the counsellor's office, and she said, "Well, you and half the philosophy department are in here. Don't worry about it. It seems like something to do with the philosophy students." And I thought, well, that's not great, is it, as an indictment for thinking? And secondly, when I looked around at the professors, saw what they were like, I didn't really feel that philosophy had necessarily done a lot of them that much good, really. Not that I was expecting miracles, but I saw the very same problems that I was suffering with in them to different degrees. So I started to become disillusioned, and it was at that time, whilst being medicated with antidepressants at that time, and drinking and smoking, and just generally leading not a great life, I thought, I've got to do something for myself. I've got to take responsibility. So I thought I'd do Tai Chi. I'd led a relatively athletic life up to the age of being a student, really. And part of that was doing martial arts. I'd done them since I was 7. Now, whether my flexibility came first or whether it was through martial arts, we'll never really know. But it definitely seemed to help, or I just did them because I was quite flexible. So I thought, well, I'll do Tai Chi because it seems like the same kind of thing, but without the fighting. Like, I had this intuition, I should have mentioned. What the problem is, there is something stuck in the body, an energy stuck in the body that I can't move. I can't think it out. And all this talking, although talking can be very helpful if you've never talked to anyone before, and it did help me to degrees. After a while, you feel like you're just talking yourself back in circles. Nothing seems to be changing. You're just almost solidifying the whole thing you're suffering, really, by talking about it and confirming it. It's like by visiting the prison, one confirms it, to quote the poet. Paraphrase. So I thought there's got to be something else, something stuck in the body, an energy stuck in the body. Maybe I can move that. And I had this intuition, if I could do a certain patterned practice, like a very careful patterning of certain movements. I don't know why it came to me like that, but it did. And I thought, well, I've seen people practicing Tai Chi in the park, they seem to be doing this very conscientious patterned practice. That seems to be like what I know in martial arts, but without the fighting part. So I'll do that. Anyway, long story short, the Tai Chi night at university conflicted with the drinking social night. So I ended up in the yoga class that was a day later, the Yoga Society, running on a Thursday night, as I believe, 6 to 7:30, I think, in the sports hall. So I went along, and I wasn't really sure. I didn't really think it would work. I thought, and even up to that point in the late 90s, it seemed like yoga was about omming and sitting around with incense and doing maybe a few light stretches. So I didn't have high expectations, but I thought, I got to do something for myself to try. I felt out of control. I felt like I could only subsist in the world when drunk and medicated, basically. Not a good thing, so something had to change. So taking the responsibility, I thought, well, I'll start with going to yoga and see what that'll do, because I'd been going to the gym a bit again, but it didn't really work either, even the endorphin rush of doing a bit of exercise. So when I went to yoga, and I remember doing bow posture and forward fold, Paschimottanasana, and I was just amazed. I was like, wow, after an hour and a half, I think it was about an hour and a half, I said, it really works. And I mean, it's a bit cliche because everyone says the same thing. I went to yoga and I felt like coming home. It's like, well, you know what? I can't say enough how surprised I was. I came out and I thought, this is going to be the thing. This is going to be the thing that fixes me. So ever since that one day, I went back. Ever since that day, in my room the next morning, I tried to remember the stretches that I'd done in that class. And then when I went back every week, I added this, I looked at what she was doing, the teacher, and I added those stretches to my practice. I did about 10 minutes a day on my own. And it wasn't a romantic beginning. It wasn't an Instagrammable beginning. Student room in a scrubby house in the Midlands, we call it, of England, so quite cold. In the winter it was. I remember it was November because I'd come back for the second year of university. And on a kind of dingy carpet, stained carpet, on a bath towel, because there was no rule. You couldn't get yoga mats easily. And I couldn't get yoga clothes, so I suppose I was in my pants, probably hungover. So it wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And I added every week or month, I added 5 minutes until by the time I left university a year later, I was up to like an hour and a half, I reckon. Hour and a half of practice. And just by looking at, trying to remember the stretches that I was learning in the class once a week. And sometimes I'd go to an extra one because I think this lady ran a class in Coventry. So I'd go along to her local class, not a student class that she was running, And yeah, it started really working. I was drinking less. I was still smoking, but smoking less. And I couldn't really believe it. And up to this day, I suppose I've been trying to figure out why it worked so well, how it worked and why it worked where anything else didn't. Even increasing doses of medication and going to the gym and all these things, nothing worked like the yoga. So it leaves me up to this day kind of confounded and trying to figure out why hatha yoga works. So that's why more recently I've turned to tantric texts and started trying to understand it through that. And I believe it must be something to do with the stimulation of the spine or maybe the cerebral spinal fluid and how it relates to the amygdala or the back brain that's to do with your primal instincts about survival, stuff like that. Anyway, that's another topic, and I've spoken a little bit about that before. Today I wanted to stick to this little story of mine, and maybe you heard it before, so sorry, it's almost at the end. So moving things on, I start to get to the end of university, and I suppose I realised that, one, I don't have any money left. Two, I need a job, and philosophy is not really going to cut it, unless I'm going to be an academic. So, and as well as that, I've become interested in eating, like properly, because up to that point, I've been feeling quite rubbish most of the time and just eating badly as you do when you feel bad. So once you start feeling better with the yoga, I started drinking less and smoking less. I started thinking, well, I need to learn to cook. Naturally, I gravitated towards the vegetarian diet. Well, I say naturally because it seemed totally natural at the time. And I thought, well, I need to cook for myself, cook healthy, start cooking healthy. So I started looking at recipe books and going to the local market. It's funny, as a student of 18, a guy shopping at the market and asking about all these different vegetables and stuff and going back home and cooking I remember I used to cook this one soup that my student household, because I was living in a house, a student house, 13 guys in this one house. I was one of them, right? So we were drinking and smoking and having a good time. And, I didn't, I can't paint a too bleak a picture of it, but I was suffering inside, pretending to be the fool, as it were, but I was suffering. Anyways, so that I used to cook this magic soup that they say, get your magic soup out and let's have some. Something like that, because I was the only one that actually cooked anything in the house. And I started to learn, obviously, I started to learn other stuff than soup. And I got a job at a local restaurant, washing dishes, and gradually chopping a little bit of veg when they needed an extra hand, and gradually learning a few tricks. So by the time I finished university, by the time I got to the end of university, because I didn't finish it, I had this skill under my belt that I might be able to do something with. And of course, well, not of course, but I didn't finish university in the end because it just, with the revelation of feeling so much better with the yoga, to be honest, it was like being freed from being in a really dark jail. And when you have that sense of being freed from a really dark jail, you don't really bother about studying for your finals or anything else. Everything else paled in insignificance at that time because of the kind of release and euphoria I felt about how yoga was working. And of course, it's not like I didn't suffer from those symptoms anymore, but I knew that I'd found something that would help cure it and help me live basically a normal life, because I was feeling like I wasn't really going to be able to function properly in the world. So anyway, I didn't finish university. I just didn't go to those final exams, but I had this cooking skill. And then I traveled around going to different yoga centers, different teachers in their towns and cooking. Like I'd stay a while, I'd get a job at a restaurant, a cafe, I'd do the cooking and I'd pay for my yoga instruction like that. And finally that took me to Crete, to what was Derek Island's place. And Derek and Radha Worrell taught in Crete, and they opened the first Ashtanga yoga center in around, God, when was it? Late 1980s in Crete. Anyways, I arrived there later, 1998 or 9, or maybe later, 2000. And Derek had just passed away, sadly. The place was still going very strong. There was up to 100 guests a session. And I kind of blagged it because I wasn't used to cooking for that number of people. But I said I could. And I was in at the deep end and I managed somehow to swim. And I stayed there for a few seasons. My season was April to October. I'd come back in the winter, do different things, and go back in the summer. And I'd basically pay for my yoga instruction there. I learnt a lot of the primary, a lot of the intermediate there, cooking for many guests and sweating in this kitchen, and then in the early mornings learning Ashtanga. So fast forward again, and because people recognised there that I was from the outside perceivably good at yoga, means that I didn't have a clue, by the way, what I was doing, but I happened to be stretching quite strong, so I seemed to be able to do some of the shapes. People said, immediately, oh, you should be a teacher. There weren't so many teachers back then. So I was going back home to London in the winter, started doing some teaching. And at that time, again, you just said you were a teacher. There was no qualifications, nothing. And there was not many teachers around. So I was somewhat popular straight away. But I knew I was kind of a fraud, really, because I didn't have a clue what I was doing. I was just pushing myself into positions. And I suppose my teaching was a little bit similar. Although I didn't like pushing people, I would basically demonstrate the postures in class and just get them to try as hard as they could to get into them. That was kind of about it at that time, I'm ashamed to say. So nevertheless, I thought, well, there must be something more to it than this. And originally, the thing was, I got into yoga, as I said, for the reason of really a mental salvation, really. And then I started doing this practice, Ashtanga, finally, because I skip away a lot of the story, right? I was doing Hatha yoga for a while, and then I did a bit of Iyengar yoga for about a year. And then someone said, well, actually the ladies in Iyengar yoga kicks me out, and they said, you're not really right for Iyengar here with us, because they were a little bit older, as it used to be at the time, probably middle-aged, often a lady, woman. And they said, go back and down the road to Leamington Spa. This was in Birmingham at the time. And there's a young guy there, he's teaching Ashtanga. So learn it from him. So that's how I got into Ashtanga. It was just random. There was hardly any yoga teachers, full stop. But there happened to be an Ashtanga teacher where I was living. But he wasn't traditional. So that was a big thing that I want to point out now, is that my background and my understanding of Ashtanga from the start was, say, non-orthodox. Like, he didn't say the prayer. He encouraged a lot of handstands. He encouraged us to play around with the practice and experiment and add in arm balances and this and that, It wasn't like Mysore's style. There wasn't any rigorousness. There wasn't the authority of Mysore. There wasn't the idea that, you had to do it a certain way. There wasn't any, let's say, other context around it apart from doing the yoga, doing the postures and and the kind of dynamic nature of moving the body. So really my background was kind of started from going from this real wish to heal myself at a deep level to, after a while, when I was kind of out of the thick of it, when I felt a bit better, just what became almost like a handstand practice, because the guy was very good at handstands. And well, if we don't take the authority of Mysore, then we generally start kind of playing around with the sequence this is my understanding as well of what I did, playing around with the sequence to suit what we're good at. So he was adding a lot of handstands. I copied him. I liked the handstands. And it did become, for a while, a glorified handstand practice. And I was then teaching, as I said. But I felt something was wrong. And something had gone kind of a bit wrong from that early start of my yoga practice, where I had the highest intentions, not only to feel better in myself, but also to understand, like a lot of those bad feelings, let's say, those difficult feelings of my youth and early 20s was really also existential. It was really the meaning of life and the struggles with what does it all mean and why am I bothering to do anything, kind of thing. So I think comes down in the end to a struggle with meaning. So that was the roots of it. But then latterly, kind of, after a few years of practice, getting good at the postures, let's say, or at least visibly seeming to be, I ended up kind of corrupting the practice a little bit, let's say. And I was going down a funny avenue, really, of just, let's say, advanced gymnastics, which is not unlike what, the practice can easily come to. So I don't think it's just me. That's what I'm saying. So anyways, fast forward, and I think I've got to go to India because, something's not right here. The teaching doesn't feel meaningful. I feel like a fraud, and I've got to go to India, to the source, as people said at the time. At the time, they said, you go to Mysore, go to the source, learn from Patabi Joyce and his grandson, Sharath. Okay, I'm going to do that. So I quit the teaching in London, and this is, it's a great whistle-stop tour through it. There's lots of other details. If you're interested, ask me later. And I think I'm going to go to India, but I'm a bit frightened of India. Everyone says how crazy it is. So I thought I'll land in Goa, and from Goa, then I'll make my way down to Mysore, having got a soft landing in Goa. Anyways, I arrive at Purple Valley, Goa as a cook, because remember, I've got this transferable skill. It certainly isn't philosophy. It's cooking. So I arrive as a cook. I'm employed by Teresa, my now wife. We get together after a couple of months there. Apparently she liked my pizza. And then we end up running the place for a couple of years together after that. And I did get to Mysore in the off-season when we weren't running the retreat. And this is where the part of, particularly of Sharath starts and Patabi Joyce, because he was still alive when we first went. It was the new old Shala, the Gokulam Shala that we were in. Just moved there from the Lakshmi Puram Shala. So there was lead classes and more space, right? And it changed, it kind of turned a corner from, this self-practice, 12 people in a room. Now it was 60, 70 people in a room. And from the moment I heard Patabi Joyce's lead class from that first week, I thought, this is different, because all the stuff that I'd learned in the West, or at least the approach that I'd learned, seemed to be more just like linking the movements into one long flow. It was like one long yoga dance. And as soon as I got to Mysore, it was like very staccato, like now the posture, finish the posture, now jump back, and now the posture. And the second thing is that it really emphasized the posture, not the jumping and the flowing. And previously, I think a lot of my exposure to Ashtanga kind of identified the dynamic movement of flowing through the postures, not the postures themselves, which I found the opposite in Mysore. And secondly, he was an authority, a clear authority, and that wasn't the case with any teacher I bumped into in the West. As much as they were the senior teachers, I'd already met many of these senior teachers that you know today, they hadn't been able to command the kind of sense of authority, unfortunately, because they probably should have, that Mysore did to me. And I needed that, because at a certain point I felt like, as much as I was always anti-establishment, anti-authority, and I took that into the yoga, and I liked the freedom of playing around with the postures and doing handstand where I wanted to, and no one was going to tell me to stop here and wait for them to give me another posture. I didn't like that. I would have been a terrible student. I knew something was missing, a kind of accountability. The fact that I had to stick to the sequence whether I liked it or not. That was something, and that someone was there kind of making me do that. And then there was the consciousness of the breathing, which I never really established in any other practice. I never noticed the breathing. I mean, I probably didn't really breathe hardly at all in the practice. But now you had this rather staccato, I always say, this rather unrhythmical vinyasa count. And it made me think about the breath and suiting the breath to the posture. And that was always a missing link, even again in the classes I'd done of Ashtanga over the period before that. But ultimately, I think it was this authority thing. And that's, I suppose, what I wanted to come back to in the figure of Sharath, because it was mainly Sharath that taught Teresa and I, because by that time Patabi Joyce was old and he wasn't really teaching he was teaching, but he wasn't really properly teaching. He was not so lucid, let's say. So really Sharath was doing most of it. Patabi Joyce would teach a class, and then he would fall asleep as he was leading the class, and then Sharath would jump in, and then Patabi Joyce would wake up and jump in again, and Sharath was very humble to his grandfather, so he'd step out of the way straight away. But, really, Sharath was in charge by that time. This was around 2005-ish, 7, between those years, 2005, probably to 2010 when Patabi Joyce died. Sharath started to take over. So, anyway, in that time, Sharath did seem like a figure of authority, and I suppose I was half ready to take it. But by the same token, like everyone else, I wanted to be special. I wanted him to notice me. And he didn't. He really didn't. And even when Teresa and I hosted him in Purple Valley, and I got the chance to talk to him because it was an intimate group at Purple Valley. We had only, when Sharath used to come to Purple Valley, we had only 30 students around. When he was teaching and he was there at breakfast and there at night, you could talk to him. It was crazy. And I talked to him one night on the terrace after dinner, and I said, "Can I come, to Mysore? Should I come? Should I come?" I think I said. I wanted him to invite me or something silly, Should I come? I'd already been once, and nothing happened. I went for a month. I was invisible really to him. Didn't get any postures. Was allowed to do primary, but nothing else. And so I said, should I come again? You'd see me practice a bit more then. And he said, yes, come anytime. And at that time, you didn't really need that much of an introduction. You didn't need to book online. He said, just come, just turn up and I'll let you in. So I thought, wow, that's a personal invite. So the next month I took time off work from running the retreat with Teresa at Purple Valley. She graciously stayed there alone. Someone had to stay, and I went for a month and nothing happened again. I went there, did a month of practice. I was given one posture per chasana in the last couple of days. He didn't notice me. Nothing happened. It was just so underwhelming. And I thought, I'm not going to go back again then. What's the point? Just sticking to this formula and not allowed to put any handstands in. And by that time, of course, like many of us, I was doing advanced series at home because I'd kind of cribbed them off David Swenson DVDs and such. So I was doing the advanced series probably terribly without right vinyasas, and the postures probably looked awful because no one really taught me them. But that was the kind of vibe that I was going with. And I'd get to Mysore and obviously just sticking to program, and nothing really happened. And I thought, well, what's the point then of submitting my will to this? Anyway, then we left Purple Valley, Teresa and I. We finally had enough. It was really hard work to run it for a number of seasons. And we decided to move to Canada. Teresa's from Canada. So we moved to Canada, taught there a couple of years. And in that time, it started to become more obvious to me that something was missing again. And also other teachers that were authorized would make comments or make me feel unwelcome because I wasn't authorized. So there was also that pressure. I'm not going to lie, that was a pressure, and probably still is a pressure if you're not authorized, sadly, because authorization doesn't necessarily count for any mark of ability as a teacher, let's say, and as does not being authorized. Anyway, so we thought, okay, we'll come back to the UK. I'll find work teaching in the UK as a teacher, and then we'll have more ability because it's closer to go back and forth to India again. And maybe we'll go for longer this time, and maybe we can establish a particular relationship finally for me with Sharath. Because Teresa wasn't interested really. She liked yoga, but she wasn't interested in teaching. So we started to go. I found a job teaching a Mysore program, and it was in London. And every 3 months a year in the winter, we would pack our flat up, sublet the flat, which is difficult, and go to Mysore for a few months. Come back again, I teach 9 months. Like many people, we carried on that program for a number of years. And in that time, once I started to commit for 3 months, that was, and I went for that third time, that was when Sharath started to notice, okay, I imagine he felt like, oh, this guy is committing now, so maybe I'm going to commit to him a bit. And that's when things changed. And yeah, I was able to accept the authority of it. And that was great because it gave me a channel. It gave me someone to look to. It gave me a focus, like a sense of there was someone guiding something, that it wasn't an open-ended kind of practice. There was some kind of sense of, again, accountability going back every year to that person. They would kind of look after things, as it were. And also more than that, I felt it gave me a way to teach. Now I knew how to teach and what to teach, that I would teach like I was taught in Mysore, like so many of us. And that, I feel, is when the problem started in a certain sense. Well, not to say the problem started, but I went back to my class in London and I started to teach them as I did in Mysore. And this didn't really work. And I think this is one of the great errors of the Ashtanga teacher most generally. You go to Mysore, you're surrounded by people that are very seemingly, at least very flexible, whether we say they've got good technique or not, or whatever, but they at least seemingly can do a lot of the postures, yeah? A group of advanced gymnasts. And then you go back home and you try and teach regular people with jobs, with families, older people often, that don't have, that haven't done it since they were young, don't necessarily have the openings, don't have the body for it, don't have the back, the knees, the hips, and you run into problems because you can't teach them the same way. But I tried, as many of us tried, to teach the same way that I've been taught. Also in the vein that Sharath teaches, which I also don't agree with, and you often see that back home with Mysore teachers as well, where he just says one or two words. You can't really talk to him about the technique because that doesn't really happen there. He might put point to one thing or push you here or put there. It's all very cryptic. And teachers back home, they like to apply the same kind of crypticness in their teaching, emulating Sharath, and it's not appropriate for teaching back home. You need to explain yourself. You need to be rational. I mean, we're Westerners after all. What was done in Mysore is good, but it doesn't necessarily relate to teaching back home in the same manner. Yeah, where it is different. It is a whole different ball game. Anyway, so I started teaching back home that way. Didn't work so well because I was as well as being teaching in London to, let's say, a varied group of adults, right? There were no real Mysore aficionados coming to my class particularly. They went to Hamish, who was a certified teacher down the road. So I was getting very normal people. And I was also in the city of London in the financial district. So older banking types, more men. And if I'd stopped them when they couldn't do lotus or couldn't do a posture, they would have 15-minute practices. So I started feeling very conflicted because I couldn't do that. And nor was I ever really keen on ramming people into postures and pushing them, adjusting them in that manner. So I started feeling, well, maybe I'm inauthentic then. I'm learning something in Mysore, and then when I come back, I'm not teaching the same way. I'm allowing people to go through and do more. I'm allowing them to modify postures. I'm giving them extra things sometimes to help. And that's not what I'm being told. When I was assisting in Mysore as well, I wasn't told to teach like that. So there was a lot of conflict, and that conflict almost has lasted to this day, to be honest, because I felt it was a second kind of salvation when I went to Mysore. My first salvation was yoga in the first place. My second kind of salvation, in terms of the catharsis and the kind of general cleansing of my negative energy state, as it were, happened through the practice of Ashtanga and being culpable, being part of something as well, and being devoted really to the figure of Sharath. What he stood for me. And as we have talked about a little bit in the blog I wrote, I didn't really realize that he was a guru figure because I always thought a guru figure would, teach you enlightenment, texts and meditation and pranayamas, and Sharath didn't teach any of that. But really he was a guru figure because he stood for a massive amount of yearning and intention and energy that was in with me. And he was the focus. And so for many people, he was the focus, and he was able to hold that focus consistently for many years with many people. So in the end, I realized only recently, yes, he was a guru figure, as I was looking for an idealistic figure of a guru with probably the grey beard and an enlightened sadhu, as it were. He really was, under my nose, the figure that I was actually looking for. I never even realized it, I think. Even though we didn't talk much, he never gave me life advice, never even taught me pranayama or meditation. He did end up teaching me a hell of a lot. God knows I can't even put it into words quite, but I hope some of this helps to kind of get a feeling of where I'm at with it. But the problem was, then I had this conflict after just having this feeling of coming home with Ashtanga. God, using the cliche again. And also just the fact of belonging to a community, belonging to a whole bunch of people that were coming there every year. You'd get your friends. You'd feel like you were belonging to something. And as a teacher, as a yoga teacher, it's a lonely life sometimes. And feeling like you belong means a lot. So the whole thing meant such a lot to a lot of us that were in that. Anyway, but I felt conflicted because I wasn't really doing what I was told to do in Mysore because I couldn't teach that way to the people that were in my class. And that lasted a long time, this conflict. Not that I was just teaching them something else. I was still teaching them Ashtanga. I was trying to teach them the essence of the postures, the breathing and what the bandha meant in the shapes that their body would naturally make. That made sense to me rather than the violence of forcing them to shapes or stopping them in such limited practices because they couldn't bind or couldn't take and probably never would. Because if you don't start early, it's really hard to build the kind of flexibility up later in life for most people. So anyway, that conflict lasted a long time, that with authority and feeling like I was a renegade maybe. And then latterly, because after a while, many years of teaching in London, suddenly, as we all know, the terrain changed. And if you didn't use social media and advertise yourself, now there were so many teachers, the market was saturated, you'd probably die. You'd probably die in some backwater. And my classes went down dramatically as more and more teachers started to open up in better centres. And I started to feel that I would lose teaching. The only thing that really I'd ever done since I was around 21. And one day I came home from work and I used to have 40 students at the beginning, let's say, from the 2000s. And in the end, I had like 4. And I'd let it go down and for a number of reasons that I won't discuss here as well, that also a lack of commitment in the last couple of years due to this personal struggle, really, of trying to find my way with it. It had dwindled and I'd got this really had almost got the sack really through having such a small group in the end. Yeah. And Teresa said, look, if you don't go on social media, do something. You're going to lose this. And of course I protested. And in the end, I came back after an hour or two and said, look, you're right. What should I write about? She said, I don't know. You know the subject. I said, there's nothing to write about. Honestly, if you know me, it's kind of funny now, isn't it? I said, I don't know. There's nothing to write about. You just do it, And then in the writing, you see, so then I started writing. And in the writing, I realized there was more. There was more to it. And in the writing, I got so much clarity about how I was teaching and how I wanted to teach. And then I started practicing again with more intent. So I scaled it down to just primary series. I would do primary series again twice a day, like one in the morning, one in the later. I had the luxury of doing it because I was a yoga teacher after all. Just taught a Mysore in the morning and nothing else. I started to try and understand what was going on in the body again. Because you never learn that in Mysore. You learn many things, but you don't learn the technique. If you're teaching to the average person, it's useful to, if you're doing something embodied that's physical, you need to know the technique to be effective, to be efficient. So I relearned how to do it as well with this new kind of enlivened inspiration that came from starting to write on social media. But I knew writing on social media, I would lose a lot of my friends in Mysore, and I'd probably lose being part of that community because you didn't really speak about the Ashtanga like I was. You didn't really critique it. It was very much like, you just stayed quiet and towed the line and did what was said to be done in Mysore. I don't know whether Sharath ever wanted it exactly that way, but certainly latterly it did become that way. And I thought there were things that weren't great about the situation and the way that it seemed to be going with teachers teaching when they came back from Mysore, because I'd observed it myself, and also about the practice. If you don't respect your own body, and use the practice effectively for yourself. Yes, up to this day, I felt this being torn, and certainly coming on social media also kind of accentuated that, because I wondered if Sharath ever heard what I put out, ever read or ever heard a podcast or read anything I put out. And I didn't want that, because I also had this huge respect still for just the let's say the figurehead of Sharath, what he stood for, the idealization in my mind, not the personal relationships as such necessarily, although he did have personal relationships with many people. That wasn't particularly my experience. It was more that reveration that he stood for in my practice. So there was always this battle between the authority of Mysore and my personal wish to make it my own. Because in the end, you need to have a subjective experience of yoga that works for yourself. And that's the high bar that yoga sets for us. Experience yourself in a positive way, in a full, truthful, integrated, harmonious way. On the other hand, you generally have to do that through method. So this is the battle, I suppose, between learning a method and not being bound by it, and finally breaking out into a subjective experience of yourself by, first of all, allowing your subjectivity to be somewhat limited by putting yourself under a method. So I suppose that's where I'll end up, really. And it's the same in the Bhagavad Gita, right? You need the method, you need the ritual, Krishna says to Arjuna, but you don't get bound by the ritual. In the end, you're your own authority, but first you need to understand what you're doing till you can come to that subjective experience of self that we're all looking for, which is completely outside a method, completely outside any rules. First of all, we generally need the rules. And this has been my battle in life, not wanting to take the rules, I suppose. But yet it's been very beneficial in putting myself under the rules in a certain sense of role play, allowing there to be a hierarchy. Because I think these days we're very unsure about any kind of hierarchies, but if you can role play a hierarchy, you see the gradiency of knowledge tends to flow downwards. So you need to put yourself, that's this idea of putting yourself lower, as you do Upanishads, that one that's sitting low. I think that's a translation of the meaning of Upanishad. Not that you actually are any lower, of course, but just to allow that you're in this certain position, where you can allow the knowledge in. You don't know everything. I thought I knew everything. And to allow that I didn't know, and that someone knew more than me, and that someone needed that respect. And if I gave them the respect, that they could teach me, because I was fairly unteachable for most of the time. That was my real revelation, to allow that maybe someone knew better. It sounds like such a silly little revelation, but perhaps that was it. Again, I'm still puzzling around everything and my experiences, and this last week's of experiences and Sharath passing. also somewhat feels like a liberation from some of my confusion and some of my feeling torn between still that revelation of Sharath and wanting to allow my own experience to come through while sticking to the method that I love. Anyway, I think it's going to take some time still, as it is for many of us, to feel more resolved to the shock, the sadness, and the current confusion of where we stand now. And don't ask me what's going to happen in the future. I still don't know, but I hope we can move forward together with it. And I hope that talks like this kind of help us be open to each other and each other's points of view as we do move ahead with this new era, but also with the understanding of what we've learned in the past as well from Sharath and Patabi Joyce, who I'll forever be in the gratitude of. Anyway, that's me for today, and I hope you made something out of these ramblings. If you didn't, I'm sorry. I'll be back for another normal podcast next week with another normal, so to speak, guest. Anyway, for now, take care of yourself and don't hesitate to be in touch if you want to be. With love, and I'll see you soon.
Namo Namah Shri Siddhi Vinayak Namo Namah